Welcome back, everyone, to the Wandering Thoughts podcast. I am your host, Joseph Seminary Jr., and this is the sixth episode. Today, we will be discussing the Civil War, uh, mainly because it's interesting and there's some things I want to know about it that I don't know. Last week, we discussed Independence Day. By we, I mean me, my friend Trevor, and my friend Sean, who is joining me again today because he is a history nerd for a reason. So, Sean, feel free to introduce yourself and explain why you enjoy history.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Joseph. As I said last week, my name is Sean. I'm from Central Florida, and I am an amateur historian. And the reason why I get into history so much is because these days, most of history has been forgotten, and not many public schools teach it. And if they do teach it, most of them teach facts that are not true, as we'll get into today. And I've just been into history from a young age, so ever since I picked up a history book in 2008 when I was 9. And since then, my passion for history has just grown. And now I devote most of my time into looking into history and finding the actual facts.
So, how do you counter the misinformation in history books without being vocal about it?
I just, I get as many sources as possible to counter it. Like as I once advice that I once heard from somebody, you have to get at least 3 sources that that are the same for it to be true. And I've always taken that principle when going into history. I find at least 3 sources with the same information on it, and that's how I counter it by saying this is actual fact, this is true, no matter what Wikipedia says, because Wikipedia does have false things. And I just go into it and present people with the actual facts and logic of history.
Right, but how do you present? Who are you presenting these facts and logic to? I mean, besides the birding server, which you don't even discuss history much in there anyway, and your family, who are probably saturated with history knowledge at this point. How are you making that knowledge available to people if you're not actually discussing it with people? Like you talk a lot about uh, sharing the true facts so that nobody gets truly indoctrinated and they can hear what's true and what's not and then make their own decision from there. But how are you doing that? That's the question. How are you doing that? Like you've got your sources, you've got your information, but how are you sharing it?
I'm over the past couple of years, I've been trying to get on social media platforms to share it, and I've kind of done that Discord and other servers. I've told people history and had history discussions with them, and I've also done the same on Facebook at times. I've had history discussions on Facebook with people, and with this podcast. That's why I love coming on this podcast because I love to share my knowledge on this podcast. I'm hoping that this will start me sharing my history with the world on large platforms like Spotify and YouTube. I'm hoping someday I can actually have my own YouTube channel sharing history.
Did you say you have had discussions about history on Facebook?
Yes, discussions on Facebook.
I'm wondering how long, because everybody knows Facebook is a pain in the butt to have a discussion on.
Yeah, sometimes I left people speechless and they couldn't counter.
So why not be a history teacher?
Mainly because you have to go to mainly because I never went to college for it, and most jobs like that require a college degree. Hopefully, I'm actually been considering going to an online college or something like that to go into public schools and do that. Mainly because the public school world is, how shall I say this? The public school world is very leftist and very drowning out the facts. Like
Huh.
as we can see that with the recent critical race theory coming out. They're
Yeah,
very
but don't
political
most
and they don't really present the facts that
good
much.
things in life
So
require some effort on our part?
yes, which is why I've been considering going to an online university for a degree in history.
So what's stopping you from making moves like getting on YouTube or starting your own podcast right now?
I don't really have the equipment or the means right now. The equipment or the means right now. I'm trying to save up the money right now to get stuff like that to start my own YouTube channel. I'd really love that. start my own YouTube channel to present people with facts of life and history and everything.
Well, I can tell you right now that my setup is like a $300 setup, and it seems to work pretty well. So you can find some cheap stuff out there. It also depends if you want to throw in a video camera or not. The video camera part, that's the expensive part.
Yeah.
So the Civil War. Yeah, so the Civil War, let's see. The rough gist that a lot of people know is back in the, what year was it? 18,
The Civil War started in 1861.
it was the 1860s. I was remembering that correctly. Okay, so back in the 1860s, the North and the South were divided over the concept of, and not just concept, why am I saying concept? The institution of slavery, and went to war over it. At least that's what much of America, as far as I know, believe and have been taught and heard. Uh, Even my own history course taught it differently than that, and my history course was largely influenced by some more left-leaning ideologies that weren't, at least when I examined them against the light of the real world, weren't true, or at least weren't true in the way that they painted them. So why don't you give us a rundown on what the Civil War is? Like, why did our country have the bloodiest war and the most costly war in our country's history over slaves?
Okay, I'm going to start out by saying that many people do say that the Civil War was over slavery, and to an extent that's true, but it's largely not really true. Because the issues that led up to the Civil War, slavery was a part of it, but it was mainly states' rights. These issues went all the way back to the 1840s, when we acquired the western states from Mexico after the Mexican War, and with California Gold Rush and all that, new states came in. The U.S. government back then was, shall I say, a little controlling, and they wanted states to do what they said. Now a lot of the states, mainly the Confederate states, wanted to make their own decisions, like we say today, the states' rights issues. But the government wanted to force them to do what they wanted them to do. And that led to something that was called the Missouri Compromise of 1850 that was presented by Senator Henry Clay. And that basically calmed things down for a while. It compromised that when the state of Missouri came in the Union, they could compromise between the states and issues and everything. Like, you can have some states' rights if you do some things we want. But those issues led up to the Civil War. Like, slavery was a main issue, but states' rights was the main issue. The South had it, and they wanted their rights, and that's what led to the first battle, which was the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina.
So what would you say the outside of, like, so you covered you said that states' rights was the reason behind the Civil War. Slavery was
Correct.
a part of it for sure, but why? What rights were the states finding that they were being infringed upon? Like, why go to war over what rights?
Slavery was one of the main ones, but there were also things with industry and factories and railroads, the way they were run, and states' laws. Like, it's similar to today, how each state has their own laws that they pass. It was like that back then, only back then the government didn't want that as much as they do today. And if you look back in history, the North, the Union, had far more resources than the South did. So that's why the South felt a little oppressed.
Yeah, but the South was a largely agricultural uh,
The
area.
main
Like, they didn't have
agriculture,
factories. They didn't have businesses. They just sold cotton.
yes, they pretty much just sold cotton, and that's why they had things like slaves and everything. Like, slavery was one of the main things. Like, as much as slavery was completely evil and everything, they believed that they had the right to own slaves, and back then it was a right. But slavery actually was dying down in the country when the Civil War started. If you look back to when slavery was running rampant in the country, like in the 1700s, and you look at the 1860s, slavery was way less than it was back then. So it was actually dying down in the country. Like in the South, only the rich people owned slaves. So that's one of the main points I used to say that slavery wasn't a main issue. Because if it was the main issue of the war and the reason why the war started, then many people in the South wouldn't have revolted the way they did because only the rich people owned slaves up to that point.
What revolt happened in the South?
The Civil War, basically, the firing on Fort Sumter and everything like that, and driving the Union out of their states. Many things happened like that, especially in states like Kansas and Texas and everything. There were actually bands of guerrilla fighters that drove the Union soldiers out.
Right, but how is that a revolt? Well, okay, not that's how is that a revolt? So you said that, huh? Because when you said it, I was like, wait, are you saying that if slavery was a main issue, then there would have been a revolt? Wouldn't have been a revolt of the Southern?
It wouldn't have been as big as that because, like I said, most of the South actually didn't own slaves. And there were actually a lot of Southern people that were against slavery. This is a fact that many people don't look at, and especially leftists don't like to hear, is that a lot of Confederate leaders were against slavery and secession. Especially Robert E. Lee, the main commander of the Confederates. He wrote several times in his diary that he hated slavery with a passion, and he actually freed his slaves a decade before the war. And another Confederate General, Stonewall Jackson, hated slavery, and Jefferson Davis actually did not support slavery that much, and he actually voted against his state seceding when he was in the Senate. So that's another point that I used to say slavery wasn't a main issue.
So slavery is not a main issue, but it's definitely a dividing force. Why is it a dividing force?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Why does it drive a wedge between the South and the North?
Because in the North, many states had abolished slavery on their own. They were given the right to abolish slavery or keep it. But in the South, they were afraid of losing that right because of the way the government was. Like I said, the government back then was a little more controlling, and they wanted the states to basically do what they said. And slavery was one of those states' rights issues I told you about. They thought they had the right to own slaves, and back then they actually did. So, and they were afraid the North was going to take that right away from them. But to an extent, they weren't going to, because Abraham Lincoln was actually not totally against slavery. What he was against was it spreading west. And that's one of the main things that stopped the South was yes, you're going to let us keep our slaves, but the new states coming in the country, don't they have the right to choose? And they actually did have the right to choose back then.
Couldn't one argue that you shouldn't have the right to choose to enslave one person over another?
Well, that's why I say you gotta look at the context of the times, because back then people said it was a right. Nowadays we know it's not a right and we know it's wrong. And of course I'm against slavery. I'm in no way defending slavery, but back then you gotta look at what the time was. Like back then people believed it was a right. Back then people believed that. It's like today's issues when people believe certain things are right, but in the future we may see that they're not a right. Same thing back then. You just gotta look at the context of the time. It was a different time period.
Right, but they were still people.
Yes,
so I think it helps us also notice that a lot of the people back then, you could go to Great Britain, you could go to France, they were also seeing black people the same way. They didn't see black people as whole people. There was a law passed in the Senate that said black people counted as, was it 2/5 a person?
Yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And it wasn't just in France and England and everything like that. It was actually in Africa too. Like many people don't see this. Slaves came from Africa because they were sold by the tribes over there and the leaders over there to the Americans.
So are you saying we never went and captured any of our own or bought any that were just directly captured?
There were some that were captured, but there were also slave traders in Africa, and they were largely in the Middle East too. Arabian slave traders were rampant in Africa. And yes, there were tribes in Africa that did sell their people to us for money. And I'm not saying all of them did, but there were definitely some that did that.
Right. So even though the North recognizes black people largely as being free, wasn't there still laws in place that kept black people from being truly free? Well, not just black,
Not
it was Native Americans too.
Yeah, back then there weren't many laws like that. Like back then there was a law that the government actually passed. This was before the Civil War. That a slave wasn't true. An escaped slave was not free when he went to the North. A slave catcher could still go into the North, take a slave and bring them back. They weren't truly free until they got to Canada.
Right. Were there segregation laws before the Civil War and during the Civil War?
Oh yeah, there were definitely segregation laws,
In the North as well,
even
or
in the
just in
North.
the South?
Oh, in the North,
Okay.
yeah, mainly in the South, but also in the North there were.
Right, so even though they were free, they weren't free.
Yeah, because the government passed a law that said a slave catcher could come into the North, and many of them actually came into the North and took free black people to the South and said they were slaves. They got around the law.
Right. Well, and now I'm curious what other laws counted as anti-black, for the lack of a better word, laws. Anti-black
Yeah,
laws during the Civil War. Let's go with that. Um, oh yeah, the black codes. Yeah, but this is after. That's not gonna help me. 1860s laws about blacks. Oh yeah, the Southern Black Codes of 1865 to 1866. No, that's still not helpful. Wait, the Civil War only lasted 5 years? Huh, the Civil War barely lasted 4 years, yet we killed more people than any other war.
yeah. But actually, many people were surprised that it lasted that long because in the beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln called up for 75,000 volunteers and got them. And based on that, he thought many in the government thought the war was going to last no longer than 3 months. They actually said this, but that was basically that theory was basically destroyed after the first Battle of Bull Run, when the Confederates
What was
drove the
the
Union
first Battle
Army.
of Bull Run?
The first Battle of Bull Run was in July, I think, of 1861. It was the first major battle of the war. The Union basically marched south into Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., to destroy the Confederate Army. Basically, their objective was to destroy the Confederate Army. And they looked at their army of like 75,000 men and were like, no one can stand up to us, no one can take us. And many people were so confident that the Union Army were going to win that citizens of Washington, D.C. actually went to the hills around Bull Run and just laid out picnics to watch the battle. I'm not kidding. This is a true fact.
Are you sure
But
that wasn't the Romans?
no, no, this was actually in Virginia during the Battle of Bull Run. And the Battle of Bull Run was almost a decisive battle for the Union, but Stonewall Jackson actually got his name in this battle for telling his men to stand like a stone wall. His real name was Thomas Jackson. He led the charge against the Union Army that sent them running back to Washington, D.C., basically broke apart the Union Army. And many people are like, how is that possible? Because the Union actually outnumbered the Confederates at the Battle of Bull Run. Most battles, the Union Army actually outnumbered the Confederates. And many
Right.
people would say, how did the Confederates win these battles? It's because many general one fact is that many generals who were from West Point in the North, they defected to the Confederate States. Like even a former president of the United States defected to the Confederates.
Which
Uh,
former president?
John Tyler. John
Okay.
Tyler. He actually lost his United States citizenship.
Of course he
Uh,
did. He
that was
defected to
one
the.
fact. That would be one fact that the Confederates won most battles because they had better generals. Like if you can actually see that as fact, Just through the war, the Union had 5 or 6 commanders in chief until they settled with Ulysses S Grant. But the Confederates only had one commander in chief through the whole war, Robert E. Lee. So the South had better generals with better strategy, and they had better, shall I say, sharpshooter. Like the
Those
Union,
snipers?
yeah, snipers. They had way better snipers than the North.
Right, I'd,
Like
I'd
the
imagine
Union,
so, given the South was
yeah,
largely agricultural, so you need to know how to shoot a gun, whereas up north it's largely towns and cities.
yes, exactly. Like the Union, it's kind of like the Revolutionary War, the British and the American. Like the Union were better trained soldiers because they had professionals like General McClellan of the North. But when it came to actual fighting and marksmanship, the South was way better. That's why the war lasted longer than many people thought. Because many people looked at it like this is American against American, and the South knows how to fight.
So how do you think that affected the citizens who were not fighting, having to see that their brother, let's say it's a family of five, a mom, a dad, one sister, two brothers. The dad and one brother are fighting for the Confederacy, and the other brother is fighting for the Union.
Oh, it heavily affected families. Like it split countless families apart. Like you said, the families like that were one son's fighting for the South, one's fighting for the North. That was almost every family in America. Like it definitely split families up. And one interesting story from the Civil War is actually during the Battle of Gettysburg, there was this hill called Culp's Hill that was a mansion basically with land. And one of the big battles of the Battle of Gettysburg happened there. And the main owner of that estate was hiding in the basement, and his two sons, one for the South and one for the North, were both fighting at Culp's Hill. We're both actually fighting outside of his house. So the war definitely split up family, and
Did
it
it
really
only
affects
just
it
split
really
up
affects it.
families? What else was an effect
No, it
of?
did. It basically destroyed cities and made cities ruin, as like especially the city of Fredericksburg in Virginia. That especially was almost destroyed due to the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was a Confederate victory. And especially during General William T. Sherman's march to the sea later in the war, when he marched through the South, he largely destroyed railroads, telegraph lines, and cities, and he burned the city of Atlanta.
So what changed the tide of the war? Let's actually, before we even get to that question, let's skedaddle back to the beginning. So the states are at odds with each other. The North and the South don't agree as to what the laws should be for the new states that come in, whether they should be slave or anti-slave, because the South, if they lost those states, they lost seats in the Senate. If the North lost those states, they lost seats in the Senate. So the South wanted them, and the North wanted them, even though they're the same freaking country. Uh,
Yeah.
and then there's a riot. I'm trying to remember. There was a riot in one of the states. Was it Kansas or Kentucky? And what happened was a bunch
Are you
of, at
talking about
least
Harper's Ferry?
maybe. Uh, let me finish, and then you let me know. Um, so what happened was a bunch of the people from the South were running around a town, and they didn't really hurt anybody, but they were burning things down and things like that. And a bunch of guys from the North were like, "Oh, you know what? We're sick and tired of this," and they went and killed a few of them. And then the South said, "Whoa, we didn't actually hurt anybody, so now we're gonna come in and absolutely wreck this town." And then they did, and then the president at the time had to make a decision on whether he wanted to declare war. I think he did end up sending in a group of militia to restore order to that particular city. And I'm trying to remember what happened
I
after
think you're
that.
referring to. Are you referring to John Brown's revolt
I
in
think so.
Harpers Ferry, West Virginia? Well, at the
No,
time,
because it was
Virginia.
most definitely in either Kansas or Kentucky.
Well, there were definitely a lot of things like that in Kansas.
So what's
Like
this
it,
this ferry that you're talking about?
Harpers Ferry was a town in then Virginia, eventually West Virginia. It was a weapons factory, one of the main weapons factories of the North. And this man, John Brown, he was actually in Kansas, so I think you may be referring to him. He did a revolt in Kansas too, but he eventually made his way up to Virginia. And he took it basically with a bunch of men. A couple of them were actually African Americans. They took over this weapons factory and started burning things down. Basically, what John Brown declared that he would take all the weaponry, go through the South, and basically free slaves, and at the same time he was for the Confederacy and the North. He wanted to free all the slaves, but he also wanted states' rights. Basically, he wanted to start a whole revolt saying, "This is what I believe in. This is what I want for this country." But the North sent in a militia and caught him and basically hung him. And an interesting fact about this revolt: the U.S. commander in charge of the militia that caught him was Robert E. Lee.
Robert E. Lee caught John Brown.
John Brown, yes. Robert E. Lee
Why
was
did
a
he catch
general
him?
because it was his duty. He was actually a U.S. general before the war. Abraham Lincoln actually
Oh.
offered him the job of commander-in-chief of the Union Army.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. He turned it down because of what again?
Because he wanted to side with his state, because he believed in states' rights. Because Virginia had seceded, and he believed in standing up for his state rather than standing up for the Union. Basically, he was siding with Virginia.
Oh, here it is. It was John Brown. Sporadic outbursts of violence occurred between pro and anti-slavery forces in the late 1855 and early 1856. In a sharp escalation of that violence, a pro-slavery group stormed the Free State stronghold of Lawrence on May 21st, 1856, destroying printing presses, looting homes and stores, and setting fire to a hotel. In response to the sack of Lawrence, as it became known, the abolitionist John Brown marched to the Pottawatomie Valley in Kansas Territory on May 24th, along with 7 men, including 4 of his sons. Determined to confront pro-slavery settlers, the group dragged 5 men from their homes along Pottawatomie Creek and brutally murdered them. Okay, so that was what I was remembering. And then, let's see, oh yeah, I forgot about this. Senator Preston Brooks of Southern Carolina beat Senator Charlie Sumner of Massachusetts with his cane on the Senate floor in retaliation for Sumner's angry speech denouncing supporters of slavery in Kansas. What do you know about that?
Oh, I read about that story too, and it actually did happen. Like, there was an actual fight on the Senate floor that shut down the Senate for the day. And that senator from Massachusetts actually had to go to the hospital because of how severely he was beaten by this senator from South Carolina.
Wow. Talk about petty arguments. Well, to them it wasn't petty. It was a matter of life or death.
Not petty. Yeah, it was not petty at all.
Didn't they have during the Civil War, didn't the South have an issue with selling cotton?
No, yeah, they had an issue with selling cotton mainly because the Union had blockaded the entire South. So they had a hard time shipping it
or sell anything.
That's one of the things that they used to try to get England on their side, and England actually almost went on the side of the Confederacy because they relied on the cotton from the South, and because England, of course, had a grudge against the United States. So
right, so swoop in, help the South, then take over the entire country.
Yeah, that would basically be it. But they didn't. But they did not join. The Queen Elizabeth did not join at all, or it was the Queen Victoria, I think.
Wasn't that because there was a particular battle that happened that the South needed to win to convince the British, and then they lost it?
Yeah, it was similar to the Revolutionary War when the Battle of Saratoga had to convince the French if the Americans could win battles or not. This happened here, the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, which the South almost won. They actually almost won it. Many people say Gettysburg was a very decisive victory for the Union. It was extremely close, and the South almost won. So when the South lost that was basically the last hope they had. And on that exact same day that they lost in Gettysburg, the Union took full control of the Mississippi River, which was a huge blow to the South.
Right, because the Mississippi River, that's the largest river in the United States. So
yeah, so when the Union got control of that, and the exact same day that they lost to Gettysburg, which was actually, ironically, July 4th, 1863. That's when England decided to not side with the South.
So the timeline goes, we have minor revolts and riots here and there across where the Confederacy met the Union along those state borders and into some of the new states.
Yeah.
So what started the war? Why did Abraham Lincoln send an army of nearly 100,000 men to go fight their brethren down in the South? What led, we go from the riots to full-scale war. What is the missing link here?
The South basically was voting to secede up to the point that Lincoln was inaugurated. 7 states, I think, seceded from the Union before Lincoln was even inaugurated because he was elected and they didn't like Lincoln. And then after Lincoln was inaugurated, more states followed. 11 total states seceded from the Union. And because they seceded, they wanted the Union Army out of their territory, basically. And there was this Fort Sumter, in South Carolina, outside of Charleston. The Union refused to leave. And they might have actually stopped the Confederates from taking it over if a supply ship that Lincoln sent had made it there. But due to bad weather and Confederate Army, the ship never made it there. And so on the morning of I think it was April 12th, 1861, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Now, surprisingly, there were no casualties in this battle. It was just them bombing a fort for 12 straight hours until the commander of Fort Sumter gave up. An interesting fact about Fort Sumter, the Union commander in that army was actually a former student at West Point, and his instructor was the commander of the Confederate forces of that battle.
Interesting. So that happened, and now I'm going to imagine Abraham Lincoln was pissed.
Yeah, he was very mad about the war. He hated anything to do with the war. That's when his advisors advised him to call up volunteers, and he did, 75,000, and that basically led up to Bull Run. Now, many of the North, as I said, was cocky about the war. Even Lincoln's Secretary of War said this war will only last 3 months because the South can't stand up to us. But then after Stonewall Jackson and the Confederates drove the Union in a panic retreat back to Washington, D.C., that's when they realized, hey, this war is not going to be easy. And everybody actually thought after Bull Run the Confederates were going to take over Washington, D.C. and invade it. But they obviously didn't.
Yeah. So Battle Bull Run happens. The Union gets their sorry little butts whooped. They go back to regroup. What happens to the general who led that army for that the general in charge of that particular battle? What happens to him?
He basically was demoted. He was called the commander in chief. He was General McDowell, and he was demoted, and then somebody else was put in his place. George B. McClellan, who was actually very good at organizing an army, but he was bad at strategy and fighting. That's why when McClellan was general, the Union lost many battles, including what was called the 7 Days Battle, which was the Potomac River campaign, when the Union tried to get to Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy, and they failed to do so and it was actually during that battle that Robert E. Lee became commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief was Joseph E. Johnston beforehand, but he was wounded at the battle, so Robert E. Lee took his place during the Battle of Five Forks, I think it was called, which was one of the battles of the 7 Days Battle. So the Union failed at that to take Richmond, largely because George Lee McClellan failed to do his duty and strategy. And after that, Lincoln basically demoted him and put another guy in charge. Like I said, the Union had like 5 or 6 commander-in-chiefs during the war.
So at what point do we go from all these utter trash generals to Ulysses S. Grant?
Ulysses S. Grant was actually known throughout the war. I don't know why he wasn't made commander-in-chief sooner, because he was the general that took over the Mississippi River, like I said, at the Battle of Vicksburg. He took over several forts while being outnumbered in Tennessee. But what really made Lincoln, but many of his advisors were against making commander-in-chief because before the war, he had actually been court-martialed for drinking, for being an alcoholic. Ulysses S. Grant. He got over that, obviously, and joined the Union Army for the Civil War. And so Lincoln was hesitant in making him commander-in-chief because he hated alcoholics. But after the Battle of Chattanooga in 1864, in which Grant totally drove the Confederates out of Tennessee and took Tennessee for the Union. That's when Lincoln said his famed quote, "I can't spare this man, he fights." And then he made Ulysses S Grant commander-in-chief then in 1864.
And given that the Civil War officially ended in what was it, 66?
65.
5. Yeah, because it was 4 years, 1861 to 1865. So in a year, the tide of the war changes. Why? It doesn't just change. You put one man in office, that doesn't change. Not necessarily often. You put one man in charge, and that doesn't change the course of history. Like, you could have the most powerful man in the world who's the best at strategy and the best at war and the best at recruiting his men, but that doesn't change unless there are other factors in play. So what's allowing Ulysses S. Grant to turn the tide of the war aside from being a smart, brutal, but smart man?
Okay, so the factors of the war that played in to turning the tide of the war, like I said, William T. Sherman's march to the sea when he destroyed railroads and destroyed fields and everything from the South. That played a factor into, especially when he burned Atlanta. That was the main railway for the South, and that was a major blow to them. That played a factor in the tide of the war turning, and also the Battle of Mobile Bay in Alabama, which was the South's last effort to break the Union blockade. And General David Farragut, who was the first admiral in the United States Navy, took that fort at Mobile Bay, and that was actually when he spoke his famous line, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." I'm sure you've heard that throughout history. It's a famous quote throughout history. He made that quote in that battle, and that played a factor in Lincoln winning the election. Because believe it or not, Lincoln almost lost his second re-election because he was running against George B. McClellan, who ran off the fact that the Union citizens were tired of the war. So Lincoln
That
almost
seems to be
lost
a
based on that.
theme. That seems to be a theme in quite a few elections for United States presidents. There will be a war going on, and a new president will come in, and because everybody's like, "Well, we're done with this war, so let's elect the guy who's going to bring us peace." And then the new guy comes in, ends the war, and typically screws things over.
Yeah, that almost happened in 1864 with McClellan. And if you remember, George B. McClellan was the general that Lincoln demoted in the beginning of the war. So
Why
he
would
ran
you
against
want to? Why would you, as people, why would you want to re-elect the guy who failed as a general for the war that already happened? Like, he failed. Let's put him in an even higher position of power and hope he ends the war.
Yeah, it didn't really make sense, but back then people were so tired of the war that they would have elected anybody. Because they were like, this war's not going to end anytime soon. So things needed to happen to ensure that Lincoln would win. And the Battle of Mobile Bay, William T. Sherman's march, and also the Shenandoah Valley. That was a major factor that's a largely unknown thing from the Civil War, was the Battle of the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley in Virginia was basically the main source of food for the Confederacy. It had the soil where everything was grown, and after the Union in 1864 took over the Shenandoah Valley and drove out the Confederates, that was a major blow to the South. Because the saying I've heard is an army runs on its stomach. And if you take away the food source for the army, they're going to eventually crumble. So that's a factor that the Union citizens then saw, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, this war's going to end soon. So they elected Lincoln by a slim margin.
So what was going on in the South at this time? So
This,
so far we've covered a large of the Union's point of view. You know, they go from being thoroughly having their butts whooped to regrouping and firing 4 to 5 generals and before finally picking the one who leads the charge and wins the day. To finally winning key battles that blockade and completely stymie the Confederate advance and even pushing them backward in a lot of cases. What is going on in the South starting at the same point we started for the Union, right after the riots in Kansas and the election of Abraham Lincoln? What's going on down there?
basically, the people are driving the Union out of their territory. And if they win the Union March South and after they won Bull Run, morale for the South boosted, and more people defected to the South from the Union. Soldiers deserted. A lot of soldiers deserted from the Union Army down south to the Confederate Army after the Battle of Bull Run. because they basically assumed like, well, the Union ain't gonna win this, and many people assumed that the Confederates were gonna like march into Washington D.C. and take over the government, which they almost did. They got within 20 miles of Washington, and the people of the South basically more soldiers joined. And one interesting thing is the Union put slaves, former slaves, into service, promising them their freedom and everything when the war ended. But the South never did that. They never pressed their slaves into service. If they had, they could have won the war because the South had, of course, a larger amount of slaves than the North did. But Jefferson Davis never did that. He never pressed his slaves into service.
Right. Even though
So,
the slaves, well, the free black people in the North still had discrimination with food and getting paid and such. Well, in
yeah,
the army, they still urged each other to join. I think I read there was somewhere around 175,000 black people who joined the Northern
yes,
Army to fight against the South.
yep, yeah, that's correct. So in
So, go ahead.
1862 was the best year for the Confederates. They won several large battles, including the Battle of Chancellorsville, Battle of Fredericksburg, and the 7 Days Battle. They did lose a major battle, though, which was the Battle of Antietam Creek in Maryland. It was also called the Battle of Sharpsburg. In Maryland, it was their first attempt at invading the North, and it was actually the single worst day in the Civil War, like with the most casualties in a single day. 23,000 on both sides concluded. And
Wow.
in a single day in that one battle, and the Confederates barely lost that battle. Many would call it basically a draw, but the South
Well,
was
it's
forced
not
to
a
go.
draw if one side can
Yeah,
gain something, or there's like if to the South, it's a win if they gain something. To the North, it's a win if they don't allow the South to advance any further.
yeah. I would compare that battle to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Extreme losses on both sides, and the Americans were forced to retreat, but the British losses were extremely heavier than the Americans. That's what I would compare that battle to, because the
Right.
Union losses were greater than the Confederacy, but the Confederates were forced to retreat back to.
So the South fails at the only thing that could possibly get them more supplies and
Yeah,
potentially more people, and that was
yeah,
invade the North. Did they
yeah,
ever have any last ditch desperate attempts to push north?
yes. That was the Battle of Gettysburg. Many people
Ah.
thought that they were many people thought they were going to take that opportunity to invade Washington D.C. This is one of the main reasons why the South was allowed to get that far north, was because Lincoln assumed that Lee was going to invade Washington D.C. So he dispatched most of his troops around Washington D.C. But Lee didn't do that. He instead split up his army and invaded Pennsylvania. And many people in the North, actually, there were actually more citizens than you think, that cheered the South coming north because they were tired of the war. So they actually and they actually started sympathizing with the South. So they marched through towns and everything. They didn't do. It wasn't like Sherman's March to the Sea, where Sherman was burning things. It was more like they were just marching north to try to find a base, and they found that at Gettysburg. What started the Battle of Gettysburg was actually Lee sent a dispatch of soldiers into Gettysburg to find supplies. And that's when the Union actually did the same. Once they realized that the Confederates were going to Pennsylvania, that's when Lincoln sent the commander in chief at the time, General George Meade, and his army over to Gettysburg and over into Pennsylvania, and that's basically when the battle started. Gettysburg was the last ditch effort for the Confederates to take over the North, and they almost succeeded. Like many people think that that was a decisive victory for the Union, big victory for the Union, but it wasn't. It was super close. Casualties on both sides were really great, and the last charge, Pickett, which was led by General George Pickett, they actually almost broke the Union line in that charge. If they had, they would have won the battle, but they didn't. It actually got to hand-to-hand combat. It was probably the single worst charge in the history of the United States, because it was so bloody, it was so brutal, and many of the casualties from Gettysburg happened on that last day. So after that, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead. I wasn't about to say. I was just going to repeat something.
Okay, so what happened to Mr. Stonewall Jackson?
He died
Where's
at
he
the
been this
Battle of.
entire time?
He died in 1863. Earlier in 1863, in the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was actually a slightly Confederate victory, but he was accidentally shot by one of his own men in the arm, and his arm had to be amputated. And 7 days later, he died. And Robert E. Lee actually
Ouch.
said after he died, Robert E. Lee said, "I have lost my right arm in the army," because Robert E. Lee was basically his right-hand man, the second in command of the army, the man he always relied on to lead charges. As you remember, Stonewall Jackson was responsible for winning the Battle of Bull Run, and also the second Battle of Bull Run.
Right.
So that's why I've always theorized in history that if that last charge at Gettysburg, which was led by George Pickett, had been led by Stonewall Jackson, they probably would have broken the Union line if Stonewall Jackson had been there to lead it.
Such is the fate of men.
They very likely would have. Exactly. So many people always look at they look at Stonewall Jackson dying like, oh, that didn't really impact the war. It impacted the war a lot because they probably would have won Gettysburg.
Right. Similarly, if Grant hadn't been promoted to, but is it
Grant had
general
been
or commander in
promoted
chief?
commander in chief of the Union Army.
Gotcha.
He promoted
So
Grant
if he hadn't
to.
been promoted to commander in chief, then the odds are the Union side of the war. Well, it's the entire war. The war would have dragged on at least another year longer. Even because if you put in an
Yeah.
idiot who knows nothing, even though the South was terribly suffering from a lack of food, a lack of clothing, a lack of shoes, a lack of men, they still had the will to fight, and thus they could have. All they needed was one good win where they get more supplies, and they could have easily swept. Because then they would have had Great Britain who might have come help, or France who might have come and given them a hand.
Yeah.
But then you have Grant, who's a genius, and I've heard he was very brutal in his tactics. That he not only wasted the lives of his own men, but did as much damage to his enemy.
Yes. Yes. He basically was brutal in winning, and that's one reason why he was so successful. Like I said, he won Vicksburg, which took over the Mississippi River. He was responsible for taking over the Mississippi River. He was partially responsible for driving the Confederates completely out of Tennessee. And he basically won the war at the Battle of Petersburg in Virginia. And that interesting fact, this shows how the South had a will to fight even though they had a large lack of supplies. The siege of Petersburg, which was the final battle, which allowed them to take over Richmond, lasted 9 months. It was a
Holy cow!
9-month siege. And that was the battle that allowed the Union to take over Richmond and cause the Confederates to retreat into the wilderness, and it ultimately led to the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse.
Right. So Gettysburg happens. The South is thoroughly routed. Now they're deep into the Northern Territory, so they've got to retreat. I read somewhere that there's 75,000 men left to Lee, and they're retreating. And then naturally, you pursue. So who was in charge of pursuing the remaining Confederate army?
George Meade. He was the commander in chief of the army at this point, and he failed to chase the Confederates. Lincoln was actually really mad at him because, as Lincoln said, you could have finished them right there and then. But instead, Meade held back and said, "I'm going to let my men rest after that battle because our casualties were so great." But if he had pursued the Confederates, he probably would have destroyed them, and the Civil War would have ended at Gettysburg.
Right. So what happens
But
after Gettysburg? Clearly, it's a decisive battle. Clearly, it's showing a massive turn in the tide of the war. Clearly, it's showing that the Union is probably going to
yeah,
drop a massive sledgehammer on the South and finish it once and for all. But there are obviously actions that lead up to that. So what happens after the Battle of Gettysburg?
after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates retreat back south into Virginia, and some battles happened after that. Like I said, the Battle of Chattanooga happened, Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia, which was a Confederate victory, happened, and it was just minor battles here and there, like the Battle of Nashville, which was what finally drove the Confederates out of Tennessee. happened, and that all led up to Grant being named commander-in-chief.
And so Grant takes
Yeah,
over in 1864.
yes, 1864. He took over
So at this
after the Battle
point,
of
the South
Chattanooga.
is utterly decimated. They've got a lack of food, they've got a lack of clothing, lack of men, and in the North we have a surplus of ammunition. Well, maybe not surplus. They had a ample supply of ammunition and weaponry because of their factories. Food, how were they handling food? They aren't an agricultural area up north. They're largely factory based. How are they getting their food?
They basically were using some of them were using resources from the South that they captured, but they did have food resources in the North. They basically created food resources during the war. That's when the North started getting agriculture resources and things like that because they were forced. But they did also use supply from the South. Like I said, Sherman burned Atlanta, and he probably got supplies from there before he burned it.
Interesting. I'm looking up some information on the agriculture of the North versus the South. And the first thing that stands out to me is the South's agricultural system was more focused on cotton growing and slave trade than other aspects of farming. Southerners utilized the plantation system, creating a wealthy planter class who owned hundreds of slaves to do the difficult farming labor of planting and harvesting cotton, keeping up with the daily task, which meant that they couldn't provide food. Whereas the North was growing largely food that can be eaten. Okay, let's see
Yeah,
here. The North, for
factory made
instance,
food.
right. For instance, the North produced 499,190,041 total bushels of crop, including wheat, oats, and more in 1850, while the South produced only 481,766,889 bushels of the same crops in the same year,
Yeah, the Union
which
basically used their factory to make food.
yeah, and then yeah, you just as you said that I read this line. It says the North's increased crops is most likely due to the recent invention of many farming machines that the South did invent and utilize. The northern farms are originally centered around little communities, but as they pushed further west, they become more isolated and only worked with their families to make a profit. That's not helpful. Oh, it's religion. Religion, and which became a reason for communication, thus allowing them to harvest with large. Okay, so large groups of families came and harvest more crops, and because families were connected via religion, they allowed themselves to communicate and form larger groups, thus producing more crops and gathering more. Whereas the South was largely reliant upon slaves to do their farming for them.
Yep.
So what ends the war? Ulysses S. Grant is now commander in chief. We've captured the Mississippi. Sherman is rushing through the South, burning everything in his path like a true conqueror would. What is leading? Lee is probably on the run at this point, losing men left and right. What's happening at this point?
Yeah, the Virginia campaign for the Union is basically happening right now. While Sherman's doing that, and while General Jubal Early for the North took the Shenandoah Valley, like I mentioned, and the Confederates failed their last attempt at breaking the blockade that the Union had. The Virginia campaign, which was basically Lee versus Grant in Virginia, happened, and this was without a doubt one of the worst campaigns of the war in terms of losing men on both sides. There were battles like the Battle of Cold Harbor, which was actually a Confederate victory, where the Union lost 7,000 men in the first few minutes because
Good
the Confederates
grief.
were so heavily fortified that the Unions just charged them and they lost 7,000 men immediately. And then there was the Battle of the Wilderness, which was actually a draw. Several of these battles were draws, like Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Battle of the Wilderness. These were draws where Lee and Grant went at each other, failed to win the battle, caused each other to retreat, and lost heavy amounts of men.
Right, but the problem here is the South can't replenish those men because they have a limited number of states and limited number of people because the South was pretty much a new frontier, whereas the North is heavily populated and they had a draft, a dumb draft, but a draft that said, hey, all you people, you're gonna go fight the war. And then the rich were like, well, can we send a slave in our place and or a poor person in our place? And the government was like, yeah, sure, go ahead. Then all that matters is that somebody takes your place.
Yes, you are correct on everything you said. So that's mainly
So
why yeah,
the North
that's
has men,
mainly,
has ammunition, has food. The South has nothing. They're getting pushed back. Lee is down to what, 40, 50,000 men at this point?
yeah.
What
And
is the
losing
final
men rapidly.
blow? Right.
The final
Literally, it's
blow
like
is
he's
what I said,
walking.
yeah. The Battle of Petersburg, like I said, the 9-month siege onto the fortifications at Petersburg, which is where the Confederates dug in and fortified themselves to defend Richmond. It lasted 9 months because the Confederates had that much of spirit to defend their capital. But it, of course, ended in a Union victory. The Confederates just got overwhelmed and retreated into the wilderness of Virginia. And that's when the Union came in and burned Richmond. They actually burned Richmond to take it over.
Right.
And that led up to the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia when Lee basically admitted, I can't go further. I'm losing men left and right. I'm gonna lose this eventually. I'm not gonna go to the last man. I'm just gonna surrender. So that's when he called. That's when he sent messengers to Grant saying, "I'm gonna surrender."
Right.
And the thing is that like you say Grant is known for being brutal in his battles, and he actually was brutal in battles. But when it came to surrenders, he was actually a gentleman. He actually many generals when they accepted surrender would have taken most of the soldiers captive. Grant actually sent the Confederate soldiers home with food and supplies
Hmm.
because he realized this is American against American. Because unlike today's society, when the other side look at the other side and like hate the other side and everything, back then they realized that it was American against American, and there shouldn't be any more violence than there already was.
Right. So Lincoln has delivered his Emancipation Proclamation, his
Yes,
speech at Gettysburg. The slaves are largely freed, but still
yeah,
they've got a massive battle ahead of them to gain true freedom in the form of laws and rights.
correct.
And then Lincoln gets murdered.
Yes, yes. Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And you mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation too. Anticipation Proclamation. That is an interesting thing. That only freed slaves in the South. It did not free slaves in the North. Believe it or not,
Right. That,
there were slaves in the North. Three states that stayed with the Union had slaves. They were Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. Those
of
states
course,
had slaves.
Maryland had slaves still. Nobody likes Maryland.
Maryland almost went to the Confederacy.
That
They
would
were
have been
almost convinced to
brutal.
go over to the Confederacy. Yeah, yeah, that would have been brutal, especially since I told you the Battle of Antietam Creek happened in Maryland.
Right. So the Civil
So yeah,
War is officially over at this point, but there's a massive mess to clean up, a country to reunite, a president who is now dead, more slave rights to go and figure out. Women's rights are actually being pushed around. When
yeah,
did they start getting pushed again? Because they were always pushing ever since Revolutionary War. Women were always pushing rights. John Adams' wife urged him to
yeah,
not forget the woman, which he did while they were writing up the Constitution. Uh, and going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. So women were always fighting for their rights. They got them
yeah, and even joining
earlier
the army.
than yeah, the woman got their rights earlier than blacks and Native Americans.
Yes,
I think when did they get them? I'm thinking
they got
1930s,
their
but
right to
I think
vote.
I'm wrong.
They got their right to vote in 1920.
Right. And granted, they still had many other things to overcome in the 1920s. But point is, even though the war ended, there was still a massive war to be fought. But then if we look at today's
Yeah,
world, a lot of people are expecting a civil war between the left and the right in the United States. The country as a whole appears weakened
yes,
to those on the outside. Uh, but you pointed out something that's kind of terrifying, and that is you said Ulysses S. Grant and everyone fighting in the Civil War recognized it was American versus American, whereas now it's left versus right, and we are so deeply divided that we see each other as enemies and not brethren. In part because a lot of the things at the left,
Yes.
like if you're on the right, you look at the left and you say none of these things are truly American. But if you're on the left, you go, oh, who cares about being American? All that matters is that we're inclusive and everybody gets a piece of the pie. So
Yes.
it doesn't make me too optimistic over the course of the country unless things drastically change.
Yes, and this is one of the things that I mentioned of learning from history. Many prospects from the Civil War are repeating themselves because people have largely forgotten about the Civil War. They're spreading facts that the Civil War was just about slavery and nothing else, which is obviously false, as I proved with a lot of facts. And many people just have forgotten a lot about the Civil War. Like you've seen in the news, they've been tearing down statues from the Civil War, even ones of Lincoln. They've actually called Abraham Lincoln a racist. They vandalized memorials honoring African American soldiers from the Civil War. So
And
many people are actually,
I can't say that our country is doing things I'm proud of.
yeah, they're definitely not doing things that you should be proud of. And that's mainly why I say don't forget history. Because like Winston Churchill said, if you fail to learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And largely today, I can look around to see many things that are repeating themselves from.
I don't think we can end on a better note than that, Sean. A reminder that
Yeah.
our country has a history. Some of it's dark and black, but it's still our country, and we've overcome a lot of negative and horrible stuff. So, do you have
Yeah.
any, I don't know, book recommendations or anything like that for getting started on? So, if say somebody wants to go and study the Civil War themselves, any book recommendations, any particular people that you want them to go and look up that could get them started on a journey of
I
discovering
would
the Civil
just
War?
I would just look. Like I mentioned the book earlier that it got me into history, which is actually a good read for adults too. It's called The American Journey. It's on Amazon, and it has a lot of good history facts. It has the true history facts. It dives into every single, like I said, the Civil War was about states' rights. It tackles those issues and everything. And I would just look up good history books that have the facts, straight facts. Like these days, one of the large reasons why history is being rewritten is because of people not liking books anymore. Many people turn to the internet, many turn to the media for their information, but nobody looks at books anymore. So if you find an old history book, like from the 1900s, 1960s or 70s or 80s, those are really good history books because those have the facts, the straight facts. Don't go to the internet, online, or social media for your information. Pick up a history book and read it.
You are where you just told them not to go to social media, which is where you've largely been advocating for history.
Yeah, I'm saying don't go to social media for information. Like don't go like don't make it your focal point for information. Like don't say like, oh, I want to look up these facts of history. I'm going to go to Facebook to look that up.
Right.
Don't do that. Pick up a history book. That's where I've gotten all my facts from. I've read dozens of history books on many subjects throughout history, and that's why I've become an amateur historian and know a lot to the.
It is a quite convincing argument to go and read books again as well.
So, like I said, just pick up a history book, read it, and someday you can get to my level of being an amateur historian if you just read history books. Because I've read dozens and dozens on subject.
Are you saying that you're at a higher
So,
level than most Americans?
in my generation, yes.
I mean, I can't
I
disagree with you there.
that's a straight fact. Like there was this one guy that I saw on YouTube. He went out onto the streets of a California beach and just asked people random easy history questions like what like I remember one of them was he went up to these people in my generation and said questions like who did we gain independence from? More than half of them didn't get it right. They actually said answers like they actually said answers like China and Mexico.
It's kind of sad that people don't even know that basic fact.
Exactly. So I would largely say that I know more history than most people in my generation, sadly. I
Right.
wish that wasn't true, but I sadly do. That's why I encourage people to read a history book instead of focusing mainly on social media for their information.
Right. Any final words on just about anything we discussed, Civil War, the current course of our nation, or even just words of advice?
Just what I've been saying. Like, just read history, learn from history. If you don't learn it, you'll repeat it. And a lot of things in our country are repeating right now from every century. And you've just got to learn the history and just know your facts. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Sean, was it Colbert? Colbert? How do you
Colbert.
pronounce your last name? Colbert? That was Sean
Colbert.
Colbert. Did I get it right? Colbert.
Yes.
Okay. That was Sean Colbert, amateur historian and a good friend of mine. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And if you have any questions, please send them my way. I have an email linked here, there, and everywhere. My social media will be down and around. Maybe I'll post Sean's, maybe I won't. I mean, come on, he's just said don't go to social media for information. Um, if you have any topics you want discussed, once again, my email will be linked. The email for the podcast, that is. Nobody's getting my personal information. But that being said, please do your research, read books, go outside, get some exercise, think clearly and critically, and enjoy time with people, friends, and family. Like, come on, what can be better than that? So until next time, this has been the Wandering Thoughts Podcast, and I have been your host, Joseph Samnieri Jr., and keep on learning.